Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. More tonight from the Immigration Minister's circus in Canberra. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. The fallout too from that massive power outage in Victoria. It's continuing, warning some Victorians could be without power for weeks, potentially weeks. One thing though becoming abundantly clear, unless we change course and fast, what's happening in Victoria is coming to a state near you. Now, we know it, I've been saying it now for months, but more proof today that Labor will just push on with the Voice agenda by stealth, with Linda Burney now talking about putting so-called truth-telling into the school curriculum. Plus a plan by two economists to revive the Rudd-Gillard-era carbon tax. Just another thing Australians voted against, but Labor seems open to resurrecting. And more information has come to light today about those freed foreign criminals, including, would you believe it, over 100 of them are on welfare. With 1 day left of question time, I'm sure the embattled Immigration Minister can't wait for this week to be over.
What we've discovered in estimates this week is a profound incompetence and lack of due process and attention given to what Home Affairs Portfolio's #1 job is.
It's absolutely shameful that not one single preventative detention order was applied for.
But first, it's a clear sign of a government in trouble when it tries to make its own failures someone else's fault. Today, the government sent out the Environment Minister, who I might add has no responsibilities in this area, to say that Peter Dutton was somehow to blame for the release into the community of 149 foreign criminals, 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders and more. Here's Tanya Plibersek over and over again trying to blame Peter Dutton.
We're cleaning up the mess, and, you know, the opposition are like the pyromaniac that set fire to the house and then stand in the street to stop the fire engine getting to it. You have to remember, like, the person at the centre of this case was able to stay in Australia because Peter Dutton, when he was the minister, intervened to allow him to make that application. You don't hear that from the opposition, do you?
Now, this is a stunt by Plibersek. It's classic political smokescreen stuff, because all of these foreign criminals, every one of them, 149, were all safely locked up in detention when the opposition leader was the minister responsible. The murderers, the child rapists, the 72 violent criminals are now only out on the street because this Labor government failed to heed a clear warning from the High Court that it might order the release of just one of these foreign criminals. Now, under the law as it stood, they were in immigration detention pending their deportation. But back last year on the 2nd of June, at a directions hearing, Justice Gleeson of the High Court said, and I quote, "I ought not to let this directions hearing go past without acknowledging that the purpose of his detention is for removal. And yet it seems that capacity for removal is likely diminishing from very little to none." She went on and said, in a sense, what you seem to be saying is that his position is utterly hopeless, that there is nothing that could be done to ready him for removal. Now, what that means is that this High Court judge was saying to the government, if you were doing nothing to try and get him ready to deport, and you're even here telling me, you, the government, are telling me that his case is hopeless, that no other country wants to take this man back, this man NZYQ, the bloke who raped a 10-year-old boy in Australia, she is saying, on the bench, my hands are tied. I can't keep him in detention indefinitely. He will have to be released. Now, that's ultimately what happened. But on this failure to heed the warnings of Justice Gleeson, don't be quick to blame the bureaucrats, because government officials, well, they certainly understood the magnitude of what the judge had said, because they made frantic efforts to get another country to take this rapist. Now, of course, none did. You can hardly blame them. So it wasn't the officials who were asleep at the wheel here, but it was at least 3 Albanese government ministers. The Immigration Minister, Andrew Giles, the senior minister in the portfolio, Home Affairs Minister Clare O'Neil, and now we find out too, Australia's first law officer, the Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus QC. Now, we know all of this from revelations in the Senate that 3 days after that warning from Justice Gleeson, officials briefed the Attorney-General's office. But no alarm bells seem to ring in the Dreyfus office. 3 times too, the hapless Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, well, his office was briefed by officials on this looming crisis with the High Court case. No alarm bells rang there either because the minister himself didn't bother to turn up. Once, it seems, because he was overseas spruiking the Voice on a taxpayer-funded trip to London. Another time, we know he was in Canberra, but he didn't have the meeting. He went to a Voice rally. And the third time, I didn't know where he was last night on the 8th of August. But I now know he was in Canberra because Hansard confirms he was speaking in the Parliament, but still, he couldn't even turn up to a meeting in his own office. Then there's the Home Affairs Minister, Clare O'Neil. She tried to tell us all last year that the government wasn't ready to deal with the whole foreign criminals issue because no one expected them to lose the High Court case.
We knew that there was a High Court action on foot. We knew that it was 20 years of legal precedent, and we were advised that it was likely that the Commonwealth would win the case, that is, allow us to do what we wanted to do, which is keep these people in detention.
Well, you just heard me explain why that claim from O'Neil just simply doesn't stack up. Justice Gleeson warned everyone in that courtroom. Dreyfus was briefed. The Giles office was warned 3 times, even if the minister didn't show up. So there's really only 2 conclusions that could be drawn then from that statement by O'Neil in November. That she, like Giles, wasn't on top of the brief either, or that simply she's not telling the truth. But as bad as it was for the government not to have anticipated this and not to have prepared for it when the court made its decision last November, it's much, much worse that still, even today, the government's not got its act together. Some 20 senior government lawyers have reportedly been working for months on trying to get the worst of these criminals locked up, since those new laws, of course, were passed last year. But so far, not a single application, not one, has been made. And the Immigration Minister still, well, he's bumbling around in the Parliament, denying that there's anything he could have done better, yet still failing to get anything done. As he said yesterday and again today, all 149 foreign criminals, he says, are being continuously monitored.
How can the minister claim they are being continuously monitored if, in fact, they've been left to their own devices to commit crimes?
Is the minister seriously suggesting that a rapist is continuously monitored because they have periodic reporting requirements?
Of course it is the case that we are able to know the location of every individual in this cohort.
Failing to conduct continuous monitoring that would prevent criminals from committing further criminal offences.
But as even Giles admits, if not everyone is wearing an ankle bracelet, and we find out this week, of course, that not everyone is wearing an ankle bracelet, then how are they continuously monitored?
The Minister advised the House in relation to the 149 criminals released from immigration detention that each one of them is being continuously monitored. But we now know that the Minister has exempted 36 of them from continuous ankle monitoring. On what basis did the Minister claim they are being continuously monitored? Why did the Minister mislead the House?
As I just said to the question asked by the member for Wannon, because of the entirety of the 4 layers of protection, at least one of which applying to every member of the cohort, strict visa conditions, which include, of course, reporting requirements, as you would be well aware, as well as electronic monitoring for the majority, and curfews for many, the location of every individual in this cohort is known.
Remember my point last night? He's a hostage to his notes. He can't look the opposition in the eyes. Because the truth is they are not continuously monitored. The truth is they're out in the community, suburbs near you, living on taxpayer handouts in accommodation paid for you by taxpayers. The Albanese government, they have no idea how they're going to fix this mess. Now, honestly, it is a shambles. It's incompetence on an epic scale. And the fact that the Prime Minister has not kept this minister up to the mark, the fact that the Prime Minister has not sacked this minister, means that in the end, Anthony Albanese wears this. He has chosen to keep Andrew Giles in his job. He's chosen to keep Claire O'Neill there as well. So this is an Albanese problem. And look, speaking of epic incompetence, here's more. Yesterday, over 500,000 Victorian households lost their power. That's roughly about a fifth of the state because we just don't have enough electricity. Last night, 6 main suburban train lines, they were shut down, and traffic lights across Melbourne went out, meaning commuter chaos. Perhaps a quarter of homes tonight are still without power, 24 hours on, and it may be weeks before everyone is reconnected. Now, the Victorian Premier says it's all the fault of, quote, extreme weather. Well, extreme weather was only mid-30s, and we could all anticipate that. Now, leaving aside her blame shifting for a moment, we should be able to expect redundancy is built into any first world power grid so that the loss of a couple of towers doesn't cause this crisis. That's what happened in Victoria yesterday. However, it seems that even before some of these transmission towers went down, the energy market operator was already negotiating emergency supplies to cover the late afternoon peak, and that around 90,000 customers had already been cut off. As the former Resources Minister Keith Pitt told me here last night, we are looking at the future under a grid dominated by unreliable, weather-dependent power.
This is the challenge when the network is so unstable and so reliant on intermittent wind and solar, for example. I mean, the idea that we are going to have the nation and our economy rely on the weather, and you've got extreme weather conditions in Victoria right now. Imagine if that damage was hailstorms right throughout a couple of thousand megawatts of solar panels, which you've got in Victoria.
Yes, he's a politician. Yes, he's a former minister in this area, but he's also an electrical engineer. And this is an issue not just for Victoria, but right across the country. As I said, there's just not enough electricity, as shown when the wholesale power price went up to around $16,000 per megawatt hour before the system went down. Now, $16,000 in Victoria, while that same megawatt of power cost Queenslanders $60. As the head of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce said today, support for net zero would, he said, start to weaken if the reliability, affordability and security of supply could not be guaranteed. This outage, said Paul Guerra, merely highlights how fragile our system is. Now, that's the understatement of the year. If you think yesterday was bad, just wait until Labor cuts off all our coal and gas. Armageddon and then some. As I said, a lot happening in Canberra. We'll get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
A Senate estimates hearing has been told that Australia's now retired fleet of Taipan helicopters have not been fully dismantled, and the Army never advised they were unsafe to fly.
Do you accept the fact that the Defence Force is telling people in the Australian community that this helicopter is safe?
Senator, we've never made any claims that the aircraft isn't safe.
Defence says it decided against gifting the choppers to Ukraine because they were not suitable for evacuating battlefield casualties. Ahead of the anticipated release of the Surface Fleet Review next week, Defence officials were grilled about why it has not been made public yet, given it's been on Richard Marls's desk since September.
What's taking so long? I think it is entirely appropriate that the government take the time it needs to work through such issues of fundamental importance to the Australian Defence Force.
ADF Chief Angus Campbell also conceding flaws led to the appointment of a Fijian colonel accused of torture.
I take that as my accountability for the appointment.
He says the ADF is falling short of its recruitment and retention targets, taking close to 10 months between signing up and service. Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie has set a test for his Labor counterpart to get more funding.
If he can't get new money for this May budget, he should resign as Minister for Defence.
Immigration Minister Andrew Giles has defended his decision to miss crucial meetings around the NZYQ court case that saw the release of 149 detainees from immigration detention, including several criminals.
The location of every individual in this cohort is known.
While Mr Giles campaigned for a yes vote in the Voice referendum and attended a Labor conference in London, the government was being warned the case was likely to fail.
Quite frankly, what we've discovered in estimates this week is a profound incompetence and lack of due process.
Treasury has been granted tens of millions of dollars to sell the government's amended Stage 3 tax cut policy.
The decision of government is to agree to a campaign of up to $40 million over 2 financial years.
Any advertising blitz will not start until after the Dunkley by-election on March 2.
All right, let's get straight into it. Sky News senior political reporter Trudy McIntosh in Canberra and National Affairs editor for the Daily Telegraph, of course, Sky News host James Morrow. Well, it's been a litany of disasters for the government today, Trudy. This week, really, to be fair, I think they absolutely won last week, and it's been well, I call Andrew Giles a bit of a suicide bomber. I think that's fair enough. And it's continued again today. We find out 149, here's the caseload, here's their crimes. We know that this week. We now know where they live. Forced to hand over this information, of course, by Senator James Paterson. We learn that Giles missed 3 High Court briefings. Fine, missed one, maybe, Minister, but you had 3 opportunities. You missed them all. We know that they didn't file a single application to put any of these criminals back into detention. They've got the laws. They're not using them. Now the final hit today, we find out over 100 of these criminals are all living on welfare. We also learned too the Attorney General, not just Giles, the Attorney General's office was briefed, Prime Minister's office, well, Prime Minister and Cabinet, they were in the loop. I mean, it's going from bad to worse, Trudy.
Yeah, I think it was a level of complacency really inside Labor last year, not believing, as you saw in your editorial, Peter, what had been pretty clear guidance and warning from Justice Gleeson in the High Court, and that had been briefed to Dreyfus in terms of her view on keeping someone indefinitely in detention, essentially signalling that these years and years of bipartisanship on this policy that allowed you to keep people in immigration detention indefinitely was about to be completely upended in the High Court. They just seemed caught off guard on this, and then the handling of this since then to now has been pretty troubling. I think from my view inside government, people you speak to, they thought this issue had gone away before Christmas and acknowledged, we didn't handle that well. And suddenly when it comes splatting here again at the start of this week, they still don't seem to be addressing it head on.
Yeah, but you and I know, Trudy, I'll just stay with you for a moment. You and I know, I mean, when a minister's in the gun, even if it's between parliamentary weeks, right, they go home, they take the briefing, they call their department in, they thump the table, they bone up on everything so that they're not exposed the next time they turn up to the dispatch box. This bloke had all of December and January. He should be full bottle in all of this stuff, and he's deer in the headlights yet again.
He seems really nervous in terms of the body language. Andrew Clennell and I have been sitting in the chamber watching Question Time for the past few days, and he's so uncomfortable, Andrew Giles, even when it's not his question, it's just a government dixer. He just looks so uncomfortable having to answer these questions back to back to back. It's day 3 of him being in the hot seat. You'd imagine this is where we're headed again tomorrow. He just doesn't seem like he's able to fire back. If that's the strategy, don't just cop it the whole time. Try and hit back at least, but he hasn't been even attempting to do that.
Well, James, Labor's strategy is not to actually make the minister do better. Their strategy this morning was to sort of roll out Tanya Plibersek and try and blame this on Peter Dutton. Now, the difference between Dutton and Giles, whatever they might want to say, well, there's 2 things here, actually. They've spent months and months and months trying to say Dutton's a terrible, tough man. Today, they're trying to say he's too soft on criminals. Well, no one believes that. But the other issue is, under Giles, 148 foreign criminals are on the street. Under Dutton, they were locked up.
Well, yeah, look, all of that is correct. And I think it's just, look at this a little bit more broadly, too. What you point out about Tanya Plibersek and the attack lines on Dutton is fascinating to me, because when you watch Question Time, of course, every day they keep accusing the coalition of being negative and saying bad things and, not being positive and helpful and constructive. And yet, when cornered, they go to exactly that playbook. The real problem here, though, Peter, and I think people generally sense this, is the reason why they got caught off guard on this is because fundamentally Labor has a big problem with borders. Andrew Giles is a man of the left where they have a huge problem with borders. So they never really quite understood this issue. They don't understand why this is quite such an important issue, I think, to the community as well as the coalition. It's not in their DNA. That's why they're so exposed, and that's why I think Andrew Giles has this sort of deer in the headlights, why is everybody picking on me kind of look, when he's there, as you say, stiffly answering the questions and, not able to punch back because he doesn't have intellectually any solid ground to fight from.
Now, and I remind you, before he entered Parliament, he was a lawyer and he was out there defending the boat people on the infamous Tampa ship all those years ago. I'll come back to this issue with the Immigration Shadow Minister Dan Tehan in a moment. But Trudy, take us through this fight in the Northern Territory. The Deputy Chief Minister up there had shares in an alcohol company, bought only months before. He was a driving force behind the decision of the Territory government not to extend those alcohol bans. We all saw what happened when alcohol was put back into those town camps. He's really under fire.
Well, and the tell here is that he divested these shares in Metcash at the time Natasha Files, the then Chief Minister, had to resign because of her share scandal. So he looked and realised, oh, God, what am I doing with these? But now he is under full attack from the opposition, quite rightly, over whether he declared this when they were around the cabinet table making decisions about alcohol bans. Did he stand up and say, as he has to, well, I have to declare a conflict of interest. I have these shares all over. When I went and looked it up here, he only owns, at the time, he bought them for $436. Why would you bother buying shares in an area you're going to have to talk about around the cabinet table? It just seems reckless to have bought them in the first place.
Matt Cunningham seems to think he won't survive. What do you think?
Well, Matt would know better than me. He's got all the mail up there from the NT. It just seems like it stinks once you're getting to this point of the government, saying, oh, we can't tell you whether he told us around the cabinet table. He either did or didn't declare it, and that has to be the end of the matter. It was good enough for the Chief Minister, the former one. It should be good enough for the current deputy.
Hey, James, just quickly, we find out there's more Chinese-made surveillance cameras in and around government buildings. But in Victoria, we find they're sitting in state MPs' offices. Now, I thought we cleaned our act up here.
Well, yeah, look, I think certainly federally we've cleaned our act up somewhat. But the thing is, this is a big worry because these cameras, of course, are owned by Chinese companies. And under Chinese state security laws, they all have to act essentially as agents for the Chinese state and intelligence services if and so requested. So, it's not just what they could spy on. It's that they could be monitoring activity, seeing when things are busy. They could tell when a crisis is coming. They could tell an awful lot of bits just gleaning patterns of arrival, departure. There's all sorts of things that they could be picking up and putting together with all sorts of other data they're getting. Huge worry. They've got to rip these things out tomorrow, it seems to me.
And Trudy, the almost extinct spectre of Liberal government around the country could end March the 23rd. Tasmania goes to a state election.
Yeah, another roll of the dice here for Jeremy Rockcliffe. It's been pretty testy for some time. Even before Christmas, there'd been the threat of this early election. He's pulled the trigger today, taking Tasmanians to the polls. He says the situation was unworkable with the current parliament. There's a lot of people who turn independents when you look at this in Tasmania, and that's what's happened to him in terms of two former Liberals. Wasn't able to get the deal he wanted with them in terms of not letting them vote for anything when it comes to the opposition. So now the whole state's going to the polls. And the interesting thing about Tassie, Peter, is their voting system. They're expanding the parliament from 25 seats at the moment to 35, and they've got Hare Clark, which is a funny system of electing MPs. And so potentially, even though he says the current parliament's unworkable, they could actually get more independents after this next election, and things could be even more tricky for him dealing with a crossbench.
Yeah, Hare Clark is a nightmare. I do not want to be sitting around the desk there on March the 23rd trying to work out who's going to form government. Thank you both for your times. James Morrow there, Trudy, you're wonderful as always. All right, let's go back to that whole issue of the Albanese government claiming they were blindsided by that High Court ruling. They couldn't predict it. They didn't think they were going to lose. We learn now, obviously, this week that they had been briefed It was there very clearly in Justice Gleeson's directional hearing, her language and the material made available publicly, but the officers were told. Some ministers, of course, did not turn up, but we know it went as high as the Prime Minister's own department. So we didn't need to do what we did and put 149 foreign criminals out on the street. Someone who's followed this very closely for months, Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, Dan Tehan, joins me now. Well, I make the point, Dan, a little earlier in the show, it has taken us a long time to get some truth. We now know how many people are out, we know what states they're living in, we know the extent of their pretty horrific crimes. We also know, and I think you made this point last year, the High Court decision pertained to just one individual. But Labor clearly panicked and put a whole lot of others out onto the street. But we also now know they were warned. I don't think we've got you there, have we? We haven't got you?
No.
Right, I'm going to take a quick break. We'll cut. I know I've got you. Have I got you there, Dan Tehan?
Yeah, you do, Peter, and yes, we do know that they were warned. We know that they were warned in June, and what we also know, and this is just completely and utterly damning, the Minister for Immigration, Andrew Giles's office, then had 3 briefings with the legal counsel of the Department of Home Affairs after they knew that they had been warned that there was a danger. He didn't turn up to any of those 3 meetings. One was held in Canberra. He managed to turn up to a voice rally, not to the meeting with the legal counsel from the Department of Home Affairs. The other was held when he was in the United Kingdom, and he had time to do a video promoting the voice referendum, yet he didn't have time to get on the phone to join the meeting with the legal counsel with his own office. And the other meeting, we don't know why he didn't turn up. He wasn't doing anything to do with the voice on that day as far as we can tell, but he just didn't bother to turn up. Now, as you know, when you're seriously considering an issue that ultimately led to 149 people being freed by the government onto the streets, hardened criminals, 7 murderers, 37 sex offenders, you should be at those meetings. And that alone should be enough for the Prime Minister to sack the hapless and hopeless Immigration Minister.
Yeah, OK, so he was given 3 warnings. Sure he did in front, but his office knew, his department knew. We know that the Attorney-General was warned. We know there are other discussions across the board. We know Prime Minister and Cabinet was warned. Anyone who reads the transcripts of that court hearing with Justice Gleeson can read it, I think, in pretty much plain English. So the worst happens, they are released, and then you've got Claire O'Neill, and I played a clip of what she said a little earlier, out there saying, well, we had no idea this outcome was going to happen. We didn't have a plan B because we were always advised we would win the case. Well, that looks like a lie. And then you pursued the Minister today, Andrew Giles, over this idea that he is continuously monitoring these people. But how is that the case, Dan, when we know a lot of them aren't even wearing ankle bracelets?
Well, that's right. They're continuously monitoring people, and 36 of them don't have ankle bracelets. So we asked him why and how he can say that in the Parliament and why he hasn't misled the Parliament. Of course, he couldn't respond to that. And while they were continuously monitoring people, you've got to remember 18 of these people have re-offended. So if they were continuously monitoring them, they've continuously monitored them while they were re-offending. It just doesn't make any sense, and nothing the Minister is saying in his answers today or throughout the week make any sense. And that's why I think the Australian people are so concerned that this is a Minister who doesn't take their public safety seriously. That's not the number one objective that he has as a Minister. He seems to have priorities all across the shop apart from undertaking his number one duty, which is to keep the Australian community safe.
What do you make of Labor's claim today that this is all actually Peter Dutton's fault?
Well, isn't Claire O'Neill great? She's commissioned 3 reports into Peter Dutton by 3 people with sympathies towards the Labor Party, and that's been her focus.
Now, while she's been doing that and commissioning those reports and trying to have a go at Peter Dutton, what we've seen is 149 hardened criminals, 7 murderers, 36 sex offenders, including child sex offenders, released onto the streets. What do we think Claire O'Neill's priority should be? Should be focusing on making sure none of those hardened criminals were released, rather than some sort of frolly which is about getting reports commissioned that are trying to have a go at Peter Dutton, who the Australian community know and know in their own DNA is an immigration minister who put their safety first. And that's why she's not going to get anywhere. But the sad reality is it's why we still have this situation of these hardened criminals on the street, because she's not doing her job. She's not doing her number one job to keep the Australian people safe.
Dan, just quickly, we know today that over 100 of these criminals are on welfare. We also know that no one in the government has made any application to lock them up again. We also know that no country wants to take any of them back. They're not Australian citizens. They're in this limbo state. So what happens next? I mean, are we to pay for these 149 criminals for the rest of their lives to live in Australia on welfare? What happens?
Well, it's a very good question, Peter, and that was one of the questions we asked Andrew Giles. We think that the welfare bill has now reached $3 million, and we asked him to confirm that in the Parliament yesterday, and he wouldn't do that. But the government has no answer to this question, and they've got no answer as to how they're going to deal with this going forward. Those 18 who have reoffended, if they would come clean and say how many of those are back in custody, well, we would know that they're not on welfare. But it seems that they're quite happy to see this drag along. And the sad reality is, and this is the thing that really, really concerns me, and I know it does all Australians, is we are just hoping that this huge blunder doesn't lead to more people being victims of these hardened criminals, because that's the sad reality. If they don't act, and especially those who have reoffended and reoffended more than once, to try and get them redetained, my worry and my serious concern is more people are sadly going to get hurt.
Dan Tehan, thank you. All right, quick break after the break. The demonisation of coal. Come back to haunt Victoria. We saw that yesterday, but it's something that's going to play out in every other state unless we have a radical rethink about emissions targets. Plus, the Voice vote, treaty's still on, the PM says so. Wait till I tell you what's happening with so-called truth-telling in classrooms. Welcome back. Still a hell of a lot to get through. Lots of headlines, and of course on a Wednesday, Kel Richards. But before that power outage yesterday in Victoria still causing a lot of problems today. Roughly 250,000 Victorians are still without power. A spokesman from the energy market operators saying it could be days, if not weeks, before power is returned for some. To discuss this, Victorian Shadow Energy Minister David Davis. David, thank you. Labor talks a really big game on renewables at a state and federal level. We see them talk about renewables, but what happened yesterday was it was a handful, I think 6 all up, towers went down. How does just 6 towers going down end up with 500,000 people without power and the state on its knees?
It's actually quite a complex sequence that occurred, but what it exposes is the fragility of our system, the fact that we don't have a robust system and we can't rely on it when we need it. Essentially, the role of state government is to make sure that we've got a robust, secure, safe network that gets the power to people, businesses when they need it. And that isn't what happened yesterday. There was obviously the 6 towers that went down on the big high voltage line between Portland and Melbourne. And this is not the first time that that's happened there. In January 2020, 6 or 7 towers went down in a storm event there. That was investigated, and it was found that the towers themselves were not up to scratch. They replaced them with better quality towers, but left the rest of the line without dealing with the long-standing weaknesses in that line. This then, with a range right through the city, there was obviously individual streets and individual suburbs that were hit with trees coming down and other impacts on power lines. But the key event was those big high voltage lines going down, and that tripped the brown coal generators in the Latrobe Valley, both Yallourn and clearly Loy Yang went completely down. And it's only now that three or four of its generators are back on. Only in the last hour or two, the third one has come back on. So, you know, we've seen 500,000 people lose power. We've seen load shedding with businesses, huge impacts. So, I mean, I was out in Clayton and Oakley, you know, middle suburban Melbourne, small businesses, shops, traders, huge impacts on these businesses. They've had to destroy stock. They've had to throw away food and so forth. This has massive impacts on them. And many families, there's still, you know, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 households, maybe as few as 120 now, that are still without power. So that's a disaster, and it points to the fragility and the failure to manage the system. Labor have been there for 9 years. They've had 9 years to make sure that our system's reliable. And if you're going to shift to renewables and put some renewables in the system, you've got to make sure that the system is robust. You've got to make sure that the system is not so fragile that these sorts of events trigger terrible outcomes, as we've seen. And there's people with medical conditions, a whole range of impacts that you can see from this mismanagement.
Well, that's the Victorian perspective, David Davis. Thank you for that. I want to go now for the national implications of what happened. Joining me now, Graham Lloyd, Environment Editor, of course, for The Australian. I'll make the point, I was okay here in Victoria last night, Graham Lloyd, because I'm one of the few lucky people that still can have gas. If you're building a new home in Victoria, you can't have gas, so you really would have been in a pickle last night. But I was making the point there, we're talking about 6 big transmission towers going down, states on its knees, spot price of $16,000 a megawatt hour. If you're living in Queensland, your power at that time was $60 a megawatt hour. But I mean, given where we're headed in this renewable future, if we're going to have 82% renewables by 2030, 7 years only away, the whole country is going to be crisscrossed with these towers. What happens when towers go down when all we have is towers?
That's right. Good evening, Peter. It really does confirm what a lot of experts in the energy area have been saying for a long time, that resilience is the key, and the network has been run down to such a point that there's very little confidence in the resilience of the system in any state. As you say, the vulnerability is the wires and the delivery of power around the place. And the plan now seems to be to greatly expand those wires and other infrastructure through state forests, across farmland, and they will all be vulnerable to extreme events. The industry is saying, well, the more you have, the more chance that some of it will be working at some time. But it seems to be an extraordinarily expensive way to go about it, and risk.
And look, I tell you, if I hear one more Labor minister, state or federal, complain about ageing coal stations, the poor old ageing coal stations, they're inherently vulnerable. They're only that way because Labor governments successively have demonised coal, have made it almost impossible for coal-fired power stations, new ones to be built, for old ones to get any sort of bank financing to fix them up, to enlarge them, to repair them. I mean, we have argued our way, demanded our way into the results that we had yesterday, and I think we're only just waking up to this.
Yeah, it's something that people have been warning about, and here it is. I mean, people, particularly the politicians, can't say they weren't warned, and really it's just making it more difficult to find a solution to make sure that the power supplies are safe into the future.
And what about this talk today that we've got to go back to a carbon tax? I mean, $90 a tonne, says The Economist, that have got a very good open door with Labor. I mean, this was rejected at the 2013 election. but it seems like it could all be brought back on.
Well, here we are. We're now saying, look, let's adopt the European carbon trading price without actually having the carbon trading. Let's whack the people we don't like with a huge bill to raise $100 billion a year and give it to things we like. It seems to be the flavour of the times that you transfer funds in the expectation that there's going to be some return on it. The devil, of course, is it's an inefficient way to go about things, and you might close the things that you're hitting for large amounts of money, and you're not guaranteed to get the things you expect in return.
Graham Lloyd, thank you. I tell you, what's that definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. All right, let's bring in my panel now. Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, Nick Cater. Nick, we'll get to these issues about electricity in a moment, but I've got to ask you about the voice. The result in the referendum couldn't have been clearer. Yet this week, the PM in the Closing the Gap speech yesterday said he's going to push on with treaty, he's going to push on with truth-telling. But we learned this today from Linda Burney about the school curriculum. Have a listen.
The issue of truth-telling is incredibly important. And there are many ways in which that can happen, including school curriculum.
I mean, she wants to put it in the curriculum. How about we just get Aboriginal kids, how about we get all Australian kids to actually turn up to school, to get decent results and get better results internationally than they're getting at the moment? How about we do that for a start?
Well, because that's too hard. Of course, the hard stuff is what this government won't do. Indeed, most governments in history have turned away from the harder bits of Aboriginal policy, which is really, as you say, improving one life at a time. But putting that aside, I think that for Albanese to push ahead with truth-telling and treaty, either he's just tone deaf to what the people were saying at last year's referendum, or he doesn't care, one or the other, because it was very clear, Peter, that people were not just saying no to this one particular clause, the voice of the Parliament. They were saying no to the whole damn lot of it. And what's more, I think it was the very existence of the threat of the truth and treaty telling that really frightened people away from the voice. So, you know, there was a vote last year and they lost, and they've got to get that.
Donna Duniam, I've got to ask you a question because this looks to me to be quite sneaky. Reports today about the government pushing back the release of its aged care system review until after the Dunkley by-election. There's all this talk about a secret aged care tax. They don't want them to know about it before they vote, but they say it's coming. That's the speculation. What are you hearing?
Well, one has to consider the context here. There was a bipartisan approach being taken to this review and what improvements it would bring. So you have to wonder why they have pushed back this review. It was so urgent to deal with it. We've got to make sure the system has been reformed and our aged Australians are given the care that they need and the centres they live in are well resourced. Well, apparently it's not urgent enough to do it before the Dunkley by-election as originally planned. And I think consistent with what we saw with the stage 3 tax cuts and a whole range of other sneaky words used and tricks deployed by this government, that tax, which they refuse to rule out, is coming. But they, as you quite rightly allude to, Peter, don't want to bell the cat before the election because it might jeopardise their chances of winning. That's cynical politics, but the losers at the end of the day are going to be the people reliant on our aged care system.
Nick, analysis in The Australian today says that bracket creep, this is out of those stage 3 tax cut changes, the bracket creep impact there is going to hit frontline workers, principals, police officers, paramedics, train divers, all of them over the next decade, a hell of a lot worse than they were originally told.
I'm not at all surprised, Peter. As we know, bracket creep is an insidious way of the government getting more of your money and for the government to get bigger. I mean, back in 2013, I think a salary of about $150,000 would now be $180,000. So if you were on $150,000 in 2013, well, that's now the top tax bracket. And what worries me about this is the insidious growth of government that this fuels. You know, back in 2014, the budget that you were involved in, the government was taking 25.1% of GDP and spending 25.1%. This year it's 27%. It's gone up 2% and it's not going backwards. And they get away with this in part because of bracket creep, while at the same time, we don't index tax brackets, but they do index rigorously the amount of petrol duty, diesel excise that they take from us, and alcohol and other things. So it's the way government grows without actually asking us whether that's what we want.
I might add they almost index by stealth through the REM Tribunal all their salaries, but that's another thing. John O'Donoghue, I was staggered to learn today, this is out of Senate estimates, that the land care program, which I really support, right, it's practical environmentalism. It's not the green dream rubbish pushed by the left, but it's stuff you can actually see in your own community. That's been kicked into the never never.
Yeah, you know, this is from the very same government that has immediately upon taking office ploughed nearly $10 million into the Environmental Defender's Office, not practical environmentalism, green lawfare, but has, as you say, pushed off for a number of years to the year after it was supposed to wrap up, $90 million for on-ground works. You know, getting out there and actually improving the environment is what many would say the left are all about, but indeed it's not important enough to push out the door. So they talk a big game on this front, but it is the Liberals that have a great track record here. It was John Howard that established the Natural Heritage Trust, and it's billions of dollars that have flowed to community projects right across this country and had a meaningful impact on our land and waterways. So, you know, Labor really are dropping the ball here, and we're going to keep on their case about it.
I'll ask you about the Tasmanian election next time. I've run out of time. John and Nick, thank you both as always. All right, quick break after the break. Kel Richards, lots of words. We'll go through them then. I'm gathering Kel Richards in a moment, but I've just been reading through some notes during the break. And can you believe it now, to join the army, you only need to be able to do 45 sit-ups and only 15 push-ups if you're a bloke, but merely 8 if you are a woman. My God. Kel Richards joining me as he does every Wednesday. I'm truly shocked by that. I reckon an 80-year-old little old lady could almost join the army now. We're getting pretty desperate, but that's not what you're here to talk about, Kel. The PM's Closing the Gap speech. Lots of talk about treaty and truth-telling. What is this term truth-telling? Because it seems pretty Orwellian to me.
And I think it's quite misleading. What I want to share with you is the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, because the Oxford is the final ultimate authority on the meaning of words and the way words are being used. Now, this is how those people, the ultimate authority, the Oxford, say truth-telling is defined. It means, they say, recognition or acknowledgement of historical injustices affecting Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people following the colonisation of Australia, and re-evaluation of the impact of the discrimination and often violent treatment they have faced since that time. That's all it looks at. In other words, calling it truth-telling is quite misleading. This is not the whole truth, the nothing but the truth. This is a tiny slice of the truth, and it's being labelled truth-telling. Now, you and I keep saying words matter, and these words are quite misleading to say we're going to just look at this tiny little slice of truth about something that happened to some Indigenous people, and we're going to call it the truth about colonial Australia. That's deceptive and dishonest and misleading. These words matter, and we should be fighting a battle over this. This is a cultural attack on our civilisation to say the only bit of Australian truth that matters is hurting Indigenous people. That's not truth.
OK. Just quickly, doxing, have I got time for that? 15 seconds? OK,
it's a shortening of the word documents. The idea is people get hold of documents with your personal information, they post them on the web, and it's called doxing, but it comes from the word documents.
You are brilliant. That one has stumped me all week. Thanks, Kel. See you next week. Well, that's it for me. Back tomorrow night at 6. Up next, the Bolt Report.